Do you remember that moment?
Well, and now if you look at what the Chinese have done that's been released in the unclassified versions of the China Military Power Report, what you see is a very, very rapid buildup. Even over the last couple of years, you could look at the nuclear weapons capabilities, you could look at China's interest in overseas bases and on down the line. And a lot of that has been categorized in the public view. But I completely agree. There was a time there, maybe 2010, 2012, where I felt very strongly that we need to be paying a lot more attention to the China challenge.
Zack Cooper, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Roger. Thanks for having me.
Well, congratulations on your new book, Tides of Fortune, The Rise and Decline of Great Militaries. As listeners and watchers of Reaganism know, we tend to indulge in the subject of peace through strength. And so the subject of your book is quite interesting to us. Why did it interest you, Zack?
Well, I started thinking about this book, a long time ago, maybe 15 years ago. And at the time, I was struck with this idea that I thought the Chinese Communist Party was going to invest more and more money into power projection. It just seemed like what they were starting to do around 2010. And everyone else said, well, of course, they're not going to do that. They've come up with this amazing way to stop the United States from projecting power into East Asia. It's called anti-access area denial. It's basically long-range conventional missiles and other related systems. And so why would the Chinese ever invest themselves in power projection when they've showed that it's so easy to neutralize American power projection?
And power projection is when a great power, or certainly or a state that wants to become a great power, makes the investment in the military so they could be present way beyond their shores, and blue water navies, and can impact outcomes, continents away, right?
That's right. For us, this was the Teddy Roosevelt period, right? The Great White Fleet, the beginnings of overseas bases. This is really what the traditional aspects of power projection look like. Yeah. And so the Chinese start, in 2010 or so, they start basically investing in these capabilities that they themselves had shown were quite vulnerable. And it just struck me as an important puzzle. And, I had to find some sort of dissertation topic, and it was a better puzzle than anything else I could come up with for that purpose.
Yeah, well, congrats, because not many complete a dissertation. And for those who do, not many have a book come out of it, especially one that's published by Yale University Press. So that's quite an accomplishment. For those interested, they should go on Amazon and order Tides of Fortune by Zack Cooper.
Or apparently you can now listen to an 8-hour version if you're tired at night and you just need something to put you to sleep. I'm thankfully not reading it, but somebody else has read it, and it is supposed to be posted in a week.
Oh, that's very cool. Is that going to be available on Audible, Amazon?
Yeah,
where do you go for that?
Yeah, Audible, Amazon, wherever you go for your audiobooks.
Do you know the voice of the person here? If it's not going to a Zack Cooper impersonator? You forget his name.
It doesn't sound like me, which is probably for the best.
You got to have one of those smart English, maybe someone like Neil Ferguson read your book. That we were just talking about him, the highly intelligent sort of English, or in Neil's case, Scottish voice. That might make it even difficult to understand, but I digress. Zack, interesting that you were talking about China and thinking about China in 2010. It wasn't really cool to think about China that way in 2010, kind of looking at China as an adversary, as a challenge, as a power that we were competing against. That really was a contribution in terms of the national conversation of President Trump when he came to office in 2017. If you were somebody who's concerned about what China might do to us from a national security standpoint in 2010, you were somebody who's deeply skeptical and on the margins, because at that time we thought they were going to be our great economic power, that because of free trade, it was going to somehow moderate their political behavior and even maybe become some sort of quasi-democracy. Why were you not part of that moment of optimism on what could happen in the People's Republic of China?
I think, Roger, like you, I came out of the defense world, and as a defense planner, there was no way you could look at what the Chinese were doing and not be worried, right? And it's not to say that there weren't other serious challenges around the world, but if you're a smart person with all the resources of the American national security community, you could figure out how to come up with a war plan that would be effective against China or Russia or North Korea. But China, even back in 2010, or when I was in government, at the end of the Bush administration in 2005, was a really hard problem. And it was getting harder quickly, as you know and remember well. And I think anybody that was really watching the Chinese series of investments around that time had reason to be worried. This didn't look like a China that was satisfied with the system as it was. It looked like a China that was building up to get some capabilities to potentially change aspects of that system. And I think we've seen that.
I want to get into some of the arguments and tides of fortune, but just looking back at that period of time, roughly 20 years ago. You look too young to have been, serving in the Bush administration so long ago. The concern was somewhat suppressed by our political leadership. I remember there was an important vehicle to discuss these subjects called the China Military Power Report. Congress required that of the administration, and administrations, both Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, would classify it because they didn't want discussion of the scary things China was doing and China was planning. In retrospect, that was probably a mistake. Do you remember that moment?
Well, and now if you look at what the Chinese have done that's been released in the unclassified versions of the China Military Power Report, what you see is a very, very rapid buildup. Even over the last couple of years, you could look at the nuclear weapons capabilities, you could look at China's interest in overseas bases and on down the line. And a lot of that has been categorized in the public view. But I completely agree. There was a time there, maybe 2010, 2012, where I felt very strongly that we need to be paying a lot more attention to the China challenge. And it felt a bit lonely at the time, and that there's a good group, I think, of folks who felt that we needed to change the debate on China. But you're right, it really wasn't until 2016, 2017 that debate started to shift.
We'll get to this as well, but the debate between those who want to see good, sound economic policy and those who want to see good, sound national security defense policy don't always see the world the same way. and they'll have warring narratives about what is and is not happening in the world of geopolitics. There's no question that's what was happening in that period of the Bush administration, Bush 43, and the years that followed up until it kind of became clear, both not only was it happening on the security front, but even on the economic front, that we were going to have to shift policies. But you mentioned a moment ago, Zach, about China's buildup. Very clear that on the rise side of the ledger, as you are writing a book about the rise and decline of great militaries, China is on the rise in a fashion that perhaps we haven't seen maybe since the Soviet military buildup in the 1960s. I wonder if you might contextualize that for our listeners and viewers. How significant, how big, how problematic is this Chinese military buildup compared to, reference other points of reference, what Reagan did in the 80s for the United States, the Soviets, as I referenced, did in the 1960s with militaries that were growing, ahead of World War II, Imperial Japan and the like?
Boy, I think this rates up there with anything we've ever seen historically from any major power, right? So right now, China fields the world's largest navy in terms of ship numbers. And a few years ago, people would have said, well, it's okay. The Chinese have a lot of ships, but they've got quantity without quality. It's not true anymore, right? You look at some of the Chinese capabilities. In some areas, they're ahead of us. In other areas, they're aside of us. And in some, they're just behind. So it's not to say we don't have some real capability edges. As you know well, Virginia-class submarines are a pretty big capability edge. I think B-21 bombers and some of the other new assets we have coming online are going to be a capability edge. But if you just look at what China's done on the naval side, on the air side, they are pumping out huge numbers of ships and aircraft. And, I worry a lot that we're just not going to keep up. You mentioned Ronald Reagan. I mean, it feels a little bit like the opposite of the 1980s, right? We were basically spending the Soviets into the ground. They couldn't keep up with us, certainly on the technology side, but also just on the number side. You look at what the Chinese are doing, there's, I think, a fair reason to be concerned. And our friend Mackenzie Eaglin had a great piece in the New York Times today talking about this. We're in a bad place, both on numbers, and I think if we don't get our act together, we'll be a bad place on certain technology areas also.
And the question is, how do we respond to that? We'll go to your book now because it's provocative and gives a framework for how powers respond. The United States is a great power. It's a power right now that is debatable whether we are on the rise and decline, but I think most people think we're a status quo power from the standpoint of generally we like where we are vis-a-vis the rest of the world. It's kind of working for us. We have the tariff thing and trade stuff that's going on. We have the challenges you just outlined, perhaps in the Indo-Pacific. But what we want to achieve is mostly the status quo. Of course, China is looking to change that status quo, and their buildup is a big part of that. Peg for us sort of what drives the behaviors of a rising power, in the case of the United States, a status quo power that some fear is a declining power. What drives that? It's a big part of what your book's about.
Yeah, so the core argument in the book is that what drives changes in power in the kinds of militaries that countries build is changes in power, and in particular, perceptions of those changes in power. So I basically look at countries as they rise and decline, assess whether they think they are strong or weak, and based on that, we come up with 4 different categories. So in the first phase, countries are rising, but they're still weak. Then they are rising, but they become strong. Then in the third phase, they've risen. Now they've sort of peaked and are on the downhill slope, if you will. So still strong, but declining. And then finally, when power is kind of collapsing, you get these relatively weak and declining states. And the argument in the book is that as countries go through those 4 stages, they build totally different kinds of militaries. And so just to be very brief, basically, I think what we saw China do before 2008 was what I would call an anti-access military, trying to prevent the U.S. and others from getting close to China's territory.
Build weapons that could knock out your aircraft carriers, weapons that kind of just keep your military platforms, far away from our shores or the shores of places we care about, like Taiwan, for example.
That's right. But it didn't give China the ability to go project power even over, say, Taiwan, right, against the United States. What we've seen since, I would say, 2008 is a real shift in China to build that second phase, that power projection military. And why do I think they've done that? Because I think in 2008, they looked at the great financial crisis and they decided that China was no longer in a weak position. China was now rising and strong. And they shifted investments. And I've got a project now looking at trying to quantitatively track how that changed around 2008. Now, you asked about the U.S. Look, I'm a believer in America, I think, as you are. And so I wouldn't say that the U.S. is in decline and in a interminable decline. But the reality is our economy hasn't grown as quickly as the Chinese economy grew the last 20 years, right? The Chinese have upped defense spending dramatically, and ours is basically flat in real terms. And so my view is that the U.S. has not adjusted its strategy very much to deal with that reality. We've stayed deeply invested in power projection. But when countries start to decline, they often invest in other kinds of systems. And so the 2 kinds of systems that I think we're going to see the United States have to think more about are ones that are more expendable and ones that are less mobile. And that means, frankly, a little bit less investment in power projection. So that's that's sort of the provocative argument in the book. And let me just say one other thing, Roger. I'm not saying that the U.S. should stop buying aircraft carriers and stop having forward bases. That's not the argument that I'm making. But I am making an argument about force mix. So it's about the amount of money that we put into those power projection systems versus those more expendable systems or those less mobile systems. And as a status quo power, I think our money can be spent better by investing a little bit more in those last two categories.
Well, let's go there, because this is sort of the meaty debate around your book, and it's important. We're spending, we'll see what President Trump submits, but at the time of this recording, it could be $1 trillion defense budget. And just to contextualize that, it took President Reagan 4 years, from 1981 to 1985, to reach $1 trillion. And that was one of the most significant, perhaps the most significant peacetime buildup in American history, the only peacetime military buildup. And what you're saying is, given where we are as a military, given where China is in the military, and given where our interests are, this sort of status quo period, where we're seeking status quo power, it makes sense to invest less in power projection and more in the sorts of capabilities that keep bad guys away from the things we care about and kind of shift the portfolio of investments. If I got you right. Here's the question I want to start with on this front. What's wrong with power projection? What is it? Is it just simply not a good investment because the adversary can take it out? It's too expensive? Both? What would we be giving up that we enjoy today with power projection? I think aircraft carriers and other sorts of military capabilities are expensive that we don't really need. What are we giving up, Zach?
Yeah, so I think this is really important. So what you give up when you get away from power projection is the ability to go places and control territory or control maritime zones, right? That is really valuable. And in fact, that's how the U.S. has fought for 100 years. And so we can't give up all of that capability. But the cost of power projection, as Andrew Krepanevich has said, is going up. And so it used to be, in the 1990s, early 2000s, we could kind of do whatever we wanted, right? Yeah, you could invest more in power projection. We had such an edge over our competitors. It didn't matter. They weren't going to be able to catch up to us. But now, given what the Chinese are doing, I think we do have to think about putting more investment into things that neutralize Chinese power projection cheaply, because otherwise they're going to be able to neutralize our power projection relatively cheaply. And so essentially this is about what, for every extra dollar you spend, how much capability are you getting out of it? And my view is that we've underinvested in some of the capabilities like long-range missiles that are very effective at holding at risk Chinese systems.
Why is it not an and, Zach? Why is it not? Oh, go ahead, explain.
Yeah, that's my view, is that it has to be both. And if you look, so I'm trying to do an assessment right now of the amount of money the U.S. puts into power projection versus other kinds of capabilities. And my view isn't that we should go from 100% in power projection to zero. I think right now we're probably in the 80% power projection. Maybe we go to 60, right? But if you just do the math, that's a doubling on the amount of money we'd spend on these other types of systems.
And your assumption is we won't spend more on national defense to get there. I mean, so this is a bit of a debate, broader debate about national defense, foreign policy, national security strategy, and our commitment to that through our federal budget, because we are spending currently, as you know, roughly 2.9% GDP. The last time we spent at that level was during President Clinton's term in office, which is generally viewed as the peace dividend period, the holiday, right? Where we no longer had adversaries, we were imagining them. Well, of course, that's not the world we're in. And so the common sense, I think, perspective is that we probably would need to invest more in a national defense. And I would agree with you, Zach, that the areas we should prioritize as we invest in national defense, meaning additional funds, should be the things you're talking about. But you're sort of saying something else. You're simply perhaps making an implicit assumption that what we're seeing today as an investment in national defense, that is the dollars and cents we put into it, will remain the same. Do I have that right?
So I think if you look historically, that tends to be what happens in countries who are, technically classified as declining powers, right? They tend not to spend a lot more on defense unless they're in a conflict. I think you guys at the Reagan Institute have done some important work demonstrating that actually a lot of Americans would be fine with more defense spending. And oh, by the way, our economy could absolutely handle increased defense spending, given the percentages we're at compared to historical norms, right? So I would be very happy as a defense person to see more spending. And I'm actually agnostic about what the spending level should be. I think it should be driven by the threat level. So we've got to look at China and other challenges and figure out what the spending we need is to meet those challenges. If it were me, I'd say the spending level would have to be significantly higher. But my argument is really about what happens when you look at the mix that you have of existing forces.
Got it. Like if you have whatever you have in the bank to spend on defense, you're saying, hey, let's have 60% of power projection and 40% of these sorts of things. Yeah. But I think, which makes a lot of sense, although it would be useful for you to explain where power projection is important and necessary today. Maybe you can get that in just a moment. Sure. The reality is that if we don't make the argument that more is required given the threats, and we can get into that, and we do think of the United States as a declining power, just through this lens, from the standpoint of, well, powers that are not going to invest more in national defense are going to be in the category of a declining power, and therefore we got to invest more in the denial sort of capabilities, not in the projection capabilities. It becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it, Zach?
I completely agree. And, on the point you just raised about, why do you need power projection? Well, denial capabilities are important, right? I believe they are. They can neutralize China's ability potentially to, say, take and hold Taiwan. But what's the war termination plan after that? How do you force China to cease that conflict? Denial capabilities probably don't get that job done, right? That's power projection. And so... Expand
on that. Right now we're using big kind of academic scholarly terms. What does that mean? Take us through the scenario.
Yeah, so let's imagine the Chinese sail an amphibious fleet across the Taiwan Strait. They try and put 300,000 or 400,000 troops on Taiwan. We could sail aircraft carriers and try and essentially eliminate those amphibious vessels, but the Chinese are going to be able to target those with very long-range missiles and other systems. So I don't know that the carriers would get there quickly and operate close to Taiwan. But what can get there very quickly is some of these denial capabilities, like what you were talking about, land-based missiles, undersea systems, right? Even naval mines, things like that could slow down and attrit that Chinese fleet. What's great about that is that if you can do that effectively, it's very hard for the Chinese to stop. So that's the good news part. The bad news part is, my guess is that Xi Jinping, after he tries an invasion and it doesn't work, he doesn't just stop and give up, right? I'm thankfully not living in a dictatorship, but I think if I were, my guess would be that Xi Jinping wouldn't be alive for long if he tried an invasion of Taiwan and it failed. So the question then is, let's say you stop the invasion fleet, how do you terminate the conflict? And those denial capabilities, they may prevent the Chinese from crossing the Taiwan Strait. But I think most people believe that if you want to force a termination of the conflict, that's going to be an economic blockade or something of that sort against China, where denial capabilities don't get the job done. That's when you need ships.
You need ships.
Yeah.
Carriers.
Yeah, exactly. So it's got to be a mix of both types of capabilities. And I think the debate we've had in the defense realm the last few years has frankly been way too simplistic about this.
Expand on that. Why has it been too simplistic? What are we missing from that conversation?
Because it's easy to say, oh, look at Ukraine, right? Drones are taking out tanks, so we shouldn't buy any more tanks, right? Naval drones are taking out ships, so we don't buy any more ships. Air defenses are effective against aircraft, so we shouldn't buy any more aircraft. I mean, yeah, these things are more effective than they used to be, and there's a bunch of political science research that helps explain why that might be the case. But at the end of the day, if you actually want to take territory, it's not the manned portable air defense system or, the drone that's taking out a tank that does that. You actually have to have forces that can move, that are mobile, and that are sustainable. And so
just look
it's
at
the
recent article in the Wall Street Journal, I believe, profiling Putin's modernization plans. And I believe it's about force presence being distributed closer to the border with Finland and the Baltics. It's investments in armor, not just drones, kind of the corresponding investments that China's made as it relates to a naval buildup. We're seeing that from the Russians and Putin, a wartime economy on sort of land forces.
Absolutely. And so I think most militaries understand it's really not about one or the other. It's about the mix. And I think some people in Washington have been trying to open the Overton window. In other words, they've been trying to pull the debate a bit towards denial capabilities by making arguments that are probably not entirely accurate about, this idea that, okay, we shouldn't have any more aircraft carriers. We should get rid of all of them. I don't know a lot of people that actually believe that. But unfortunately, as a result, I don't think we're having the debate we should be having about how much of this capability do we need and how much of that one and what's the right mix.
Right, and it's hard for planners because the budget's in limbo. The objectives of administrations swing in some respects over the past 4, 8, 12, 16 years. And then you just have inertia, which may be the worst of everything here because you're not responding fast enough. And that's another thread in your book.
Yeah.
Which is how investment in defense and defense decisions are somewhat of a laggard.
And what worries me is that the two kinds of countries that usually get their act together and reform quickly are rising powers like China and powers that are in a major war. And I would hope that we don't have to get into a war to do the defense reforms that I think we all know are needed. But the history of powers that are even established powers, let alone declining ones, making major reforms in peacetime is not great. Ronald Reagan is one of the few exceptions.
Well, so buckle your seatbelt. This is going to shock you. But yes, the sort of thing you said that democracies or established great power are not good at is reform. But Reagan did that. Actually, I think people give him too much credit for it because it was done almost against his will, the way I read the history. But Jimmy Carter started making those investments. And a lot of things you're describing right now, actually, that allowed Reagan then, when he came into office, to seriously take on rebuilding the military, to leverage those early investments that were made during the Carter administration and to see them produced and deployed from 1981 and out through the end of his second term and during the Bush 41 administration. How does the Reagan experience kind of play into your analysis? Sounds to me like you think of it as an anomaly. But it was a president who basically looked at a rising power at the time, which was the Soviet Union, looked at what they did, that is the Soviet Union during the 1960s, was unwilling to accept that America was a declining power, which is what the détentés had you believe, and that was a bipartisan problem from Nixon through to Carter, and said, no, we can do this. And it was a bet, not just on technology, but certainly technology. It was a bet on America and the ability to get an economy into a place where it can make more investment in national defense because the President of the United States saw it was needed. Why can't that happen?
I think it could, right? And this is why I'm still an optimist about America. And I think there's no reason that can't happen today. What it took was some remarkably strong leadership, right? And so in the book, I look at 6 different great powers as they go through rise and decline. And the thing that was shocking to me is the story is almost always the same in the great powers that reform. You have a political leader in power who's willing to take some risk and recognizes the need to take that risk, somebody like Ronald Reagan. And then you've got military leadership who can explain how to do this effectively. And when you have those two things, you can get some real rapid reform. When you don't, you often get, as you said earlier, just sort of the muddling through approach, right? That bureaucracy takes over, just continues to do whatever it was doing. And people actually just bury their heads in the sand. So I think the first thing that's needed is political leaders that recognize that there's a problem. And the second part is the military or the defense leadership that has a plan for what to do with that political momentum.
Great points. There is some positive developments presently for our country in this discussion. It's the entry of the techno-optimists in the world of defense. And this is all the new entrants leveraging the technology that, for the most part, developed outside the five walls of the Pentagon, but have significant application to address so many of the things you're talking about, and actually could be addressed, at least the theory goes, we'll see if this is the reality, for pennies on the dollar. The drone can have a huge impact on a battlefield and shape deterrence, but for pennies that you would normally spend, for the dollars you'd spend, I would say, on the manned platform. Take me through how technology, and particularly the American entrepreneurial spirit, impacts sort of this analysis. And to me, it's a core argument as to why we are truly not a declining power, because the level of transformation we're seeing from the world of technology is quite significant, and we're leading on it in many respects.
Yeah. I think that's right. And, if you think about why the U.S. was successful in the 80s, it's because our innovation ecosystem was just so far beyond what the Soviets could even dream of. Now, the Chinese are in a different spot, right? They're much more capable than the Soviets ever were. But I think we have some big advantages. And one is, we've been talking about the importance of more expendable systems. Well, I trust the U.S. military to understand how to use and operate those systems and integrate them into our forces, and give lower level commanders the ability to authorize those systems to take the actions that they need to take to be effective on the battlefield, much more than I trust a Chinese People's Liberation Army with commissars that make political decisions. Just look at the number of people that Xi Jinping has thrown out of the People's Liberation Army leadership over the last couple of months. It's huge. There's not a lot of trust there. We have a system, I think, that's going to be able to better integrate these technologies if we can get them in large numbers into the force. So we just saw today the Army put out a new document outlining how the Army needs to transform, which is talking about integrating these expendable systems in large numbers very quickly into the Army. I think we're going to see similar things out of the Air Force, out of the Navy. The Marine Corps has done some pretty courageous things, I think, in this regard already. So that's the military part. But I think the other piece you've mentioned is really the commercial piece, right? Who are the companies able to do this? And look, I think there's a lot of exciting news out there, right? On the undersea side, on the air side, you've got companies like Saronic, you've got companies like Palantir that are helping develop the software, Anduril, that are doing a lot of leading work in these areas. And they're innovating very fast. It's almost a question of whether our defense industrial apparatus can keep up, and whether we can actually procure those systems rapidly enough, because our bureaucracy is not built to do that, which is something you know a lot about. I think part of the challenge is going to be having our bureaucracy catch up with the speed that these companies can move at.
Well, that's a fair point. There's one more. I wonder if it came up in your research that I think is a challenge for us. You go back to what Ronald Reagan did and what his Pentagon and the leadership of Cap Weinberger, they made the investments, they scaled up. They couldn't. That is, the United States at the time could not match the Soviets tank for tank, plane for plane. In that respect, it's similar to the situation we face with the People's Republic of China and the PLA. But whatever growth we had the industrial capacity to realize, because we were still working off of an industrial capacity for a war. That was the Vietnam War. And so you never really had the challenge, as far as I'm aware, of building new factories and manufacturing beyond what we were capable of. It was actually taking existing capacity and simply using it in a way that hadn't been used for the decade plus prior. That's not our situation today. We have a limited capacity. And so how does that fit in with the kind of your framework as you think about rise and decline of great militaries?
That's exactly right. I think this is where part of the answer has to be more expendable systems that are cheaper and easier to build, right? Training a workforce that can build a nuclear-powered submarine is hard. It takes time, right? Thankfully, it looks like we're going to get more money into shipbuilding, but actually the challenge on shipbuilding, it's not just that we don't have enough places to build the ships. It's also that we don't have enough people to build the ships. And in fact, the people problem is almost harder than getting additional shipyards in operation. So I think the way to solve that is, if we're building expendable systems, there may be ways to just build them much more cheaply and to take a little bit more risk, right? So anyone who's done defense procurement knows that the U.S. buys very, very expensive systems because they go through all kinds of testing and et cetera. Look, the reality is with expendable systems, you can cut down on some of that. And sometimes getting a cheaper system that can be built in far larger numbers is just more important if there's no person in the loop. And so I think for us, that's going to have to be a big part of the solution to getting mass on the battlefield.
Good point. Even the technologists who want to build the attritable systems need manufacturing facilities. And whether it's a manned or unmanned system, we're going to have to leverage technology to push it out because of the workforce challenges, right? And just amongst others. You do have companies that believe that you can train a person who's currently working, I don't know, at McDonald's, put on some sort of AI-infused goggle and all of a sudden put them on a manufacturing floor of some sophisticated weapon system. That's out there, and there are people who say that's the future of manufacturing, which perhaps could help solve the labor manpower problem, but those perhaps are not facts yet in evidence. Zack Cooper talking to you about your book. Congrats. Tides of Fortune, the Rise and Decline of Great Militaries. Definitely wonking it out in this session of Reaganism, which I'm thoroughly enjoying. Let's wrap up with one last point before we go to the lightning round. Part of walking away from power projection, I'm not suggesting you are. You're just saying the mix should be different. I heard you loud and clear. But it gets to a larger question about U.S. interests and the role of the U.S. military in realizing, supporting U.S. interests, and that is what regions of the world should we be investing in? Power projection is something we rely on when you think about the Middle East and the Central Command area of responsibility. Power projection is something we rely on when we think about Europe. And those places are not as denied as you would have in the Indo-Pacific because of the challenges China poses. Take me through your thinking about the need to maintain power projection, and particularly look at what's going on in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. President of the United States, President Trump's relying a lot on power projection to get after some things that are truly in our interest, not just support of Israel, but making sure trade routes are open and countering a challenge from the Houthis. How do you think through that in your analysis?
Well, I think this goes back to the point that we were talking about earlier, why you don't want to get rid of all of those capabilities, right? It's great to have a big surface navy and aircraft carriers and, long-range aircraft and refueling capabilities. That's wonderful in CENTCOM. It's wonderful in the European Command, right? And we still have an edge in those theaters, a big edge. And it would be kind of crazy, actually, to give up those power projection capabilities and all of the advantages that come with it. It's really just in the Asian theater that I think, and not even the whole Asian theater, right, in East Asia, that we're more challenged in terms of power projection. And so that's where I think you can maintain our power projection approach in the Middle East, in Europe, but it's probably got to change in the Pacific. And that's why Indo-PACOM is calling for, as Admiral Paparo has said, a group of systems that can create a hellscape for the Chinese Navy in the first island chain.
A great set of points, important things we should be thinking about. I hope your book is being read, not just in the White House and National Security Council, but also in the Pentagon, where the buyers and the planners and the strategists are working as well. My only hope is that people don't read this and see it as a proxy argument for decline. And so the key is to think of it as how we could organize ourselves and shape it for a more lethal force, but one that doesn't give up the advantages that we currently have, as you just outlined. Let's go to the lightning round. Zack Cooper, here's where we ask our guests to share their favorite Reagan speech, quote, or book. We'll take all three, two, or just one. What do you have to share?
So, mostly, as you know, Roger, I have little kids, so mostly the books I'm reading are, about caterpillars and Dr. Seuss and those sorts of things.
That's what we'd expect of a distinguished scholar like yourself.
But I always come back to this great speech, which I think you'll know well, which Ronald Reagan gave, I believe it was in 1980, in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he talked about the logic of why we had to rebuild the American military. So I'll just quote a little bit of it.
This is the strength speech, I believe. That's right. During the campaign.
Yeah, that's right. And it really resonates with me right now as a mission for all of us. And so he says, to begin with, we have to do two things. First, rebuild this country's military strength and base our foreign policy again on the convictions of the American people. And those two principles seem exactly right to me at this moment. And I hope, as we've been talking about today, that we can rebuild our military strength and reinvest in something that's been so critical to us. But I also think, part of the task for all of us in the national security community is to make sure that the convictions of the American people line up with what we're doing and that they understand why we're doing this. And it's part of why I love the work that you and the Reagan Institute do to try and actually understand how Americans think about national security and also then explain to Americans why this investment is so critical.
Well, I love that quote, especially because it turned out to be an endorsement for our work here at the Reagan Institute. We're definitely going to have you back on the show. Zack Cooper, thank you for joining us today.